Chapter 1: The Restless King. Once upon a time, in a vast and flourishing kingdom, there lived a king whose life seemed to be the epitome of success. He ruled over fertile lands and bustling cities, where rivers flowed abundantly, crops thrived, and the people prospered. His palace was a marvel of architectural brilliance, adorned with golden domes and precious gemstones that glittered in the sunlight. The treasury was overflowing with wealth gathered from trade and tribute, and his royal court was filled with the finest advisors, artists, and scholars from across the realm. Despite his unmatched power and opulence, the king was deeply unhappy. At night, while the rest of the palace sank into silence, the king found no rest. He lay awake on his luxurious bed, tossing and turning as the weight of his anxieties pressed upon him. His mind raced with countless worries about the security of his kingdom, the loyalty of his ministers, the legacy he would leave behind, and even the fleeting nature of life itself. The silken sheets and the finest comforts of the palace could not shield him from the storm of unrest within his heart. The king's sleeplessness did not go unnoticed. His ministers, physicians, and even the court jesters took turns trying to alleviate his unease. Some advised him to seek solace in entertainment, organizing grand feasts, musical performances, and tournaments to distract him from his troubles. Others prescribed rare herbs and elixirs, promising that they would calm his mind. The palace healers suggested rituals and prayers to appease the gods. But none of these efforts brought him peace. The king felt as if an invisible burden had taken root deep within him, one that no amount of wealth or power could lift. In his desperation, the king convened an emergency council. With a voice heavy with frustration and fatigue, he addressed his advisors. "I am the ruler of this vast and prosperous land, yet I am a prisoner of my own thoughts. The more I have, the less at peace I feel. What use is my crown, my riches, or even my throne if my heart remains restless? Tell me, is there no one in this entire kingdom who can show me the path to peace?" The advisors exchanged uneasy glances. Some offered platitudes, suggesting that the king's burdens were simply the cost of power. Others hesitated, fearing that their suggestions might displease him. Finally, one of the older advisors stepped forward. With a humble bow, he spoke. "Your Majesty, peace is a rare treasure, and it cannot always be found in the places we expect. I have heard of a man, a simple villager who lives far from the hustle of our cities. He is said to possess a wisdom beyond his years and a serenity that no hardship can disturb. Perhaps he may guide you where we have failed." The king frowned, his pride warring with his desperation. Could a mere villager, a man without wealth or education, hold the key to a peace that had eluded the greatest minds of his kingdom? The very thought seemed absurd. Yet, a small voice within him urged him to take the chance. What did he have to lose? After all, the comforts of the palace had brought him no closer to the tranquility he craved. After a moment of contemplation, the king made his decision. "Prepare my carriage," he commanded. "I will see this man myself. If he holds even a fragment of the wisdom I seek, it will be worth the journey." The royal court buzzed with murmurs of surprise and intrigue. It was unheard of for a king to humble himself by seeking advice from a commoner. But the king was resolute. He shed his royal robes for simpler garments, determined to travel incognito to avoid drawing attention. Accompanied by a small entourage, he set off on the journey to the distant village, his heart filled with a mix of skepticism and hope. As the king's procession wound its way through the countryside, he had ample time to reflect on the strange course his life had taken. He passed by lush fields and cheerful villages, where farmers worked tirelessly and children played without a care in the world. How was it, he wondered, that these simple folk seemed to possess a happiness he could not grasp, despite all his wealth and privilege? The thought troubled him deeply, and he resolved to find the answers he sought, no matter how humbling the experience might be. After several days of travel, the king and his companions finally approached the village where the old man lived. It was a quiet, unassuming place, nestled amidst rolling hills and shaded by ancient trees. The air was crisp and fragrant, filled with the songs of birds and the distant murmur of a stream. For the first time in a long while, the king felt a faint sense of calm wash over him, though he quickly dismissed it as mere fatigue from the journey. When they reached the old man's dwelling, a modest hut made of wood and thatch, the king dismounted and approached with cautious curiosity. The man who greeted him was unlike anyone he had ever met. Clad in simple, weathered clothes, with a serene smile on his face, the villager radiated an aura of peace that was both humbling and intriguing. The king, who was accustomed to commanding the attention of others, found himself momentarily at a loss for words. Gathering his composure, he addressed the old man. "I am the king of this land," he began, his voice tinged with both authority and vulnerability. "I have come seeking what you seem to possess, peace of mind. Tell me, how can I find it?" The old man looked at the king with kind eyes and replied simply, "Your Majesty, peace is not something that can be given or taken. It is something you must discover for yourself. But if you are willing, I can guide you. Stay here with me for a while, live as I do, and perhaps you will find the answers you seek." The king, though skeptical, felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, he decided to let go of his pride and follow the wisdom of someone far removed from his world of grandeur. Little did he know that this decision would change his life forever. Chapter 2: Meeting the Wise Villager. The king's arrival at the old villager's home was marked not by grandeur but by the subtle rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. His entourage, used to the trumpets and fanfare that accompanied royal appearances, was struck by the serene simplicity of the surroundings. The path leading to the old man's hut was lined with wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze, and a small stream gurgled nearby, its clear waters reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. The hut itself was modest, made of weathered wood and thatch, yet it exuded a quiet charm. Smoke curled from a small chimney, suggesting a fire inside. The old villager, with his unassuming demeanor and a face lined with years of toil and wisdom, stepped out to greet the unexpected visitors. His eyes, calm and steady, met the king's with a warmth that defied the hierarchical distance between them. There was no bowing, no display of reverence, only a gentle smile. The king, accustomed to awe and submission wherever he went, was taken aback by the man's composure. Yet, he felt no offense. Instead, he was intrigued by the villager's lack of fear and his palpable sense of peace. After a moment of silence, the king spoke, his voice both commanding and pleading. "I am the ruler of this vast land," he began, "yet I find no peace in my crown, no rest in my palace. I have come to seek your wisdom, for I hear you possess the serenity I lack. Tell me, how can I find the peace that has eluded me?" The old man listened intently, his gaze unwavering. When the king finished, the villager nodded thoughtfully. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady and kind, peace is not something that can be explained or given through words. It is a way of living, a state of being. If you truly wish to understand, I invite you to stay here with me. Live as I do for a few days. Experience my life, and perhaps you will find the answers you seek. The king's entourage exchanged incredulous glances. The very idea of their monarch staying in such humble quarters was unthinkable. But the king, though skeptical, felt a glimmer of hope. There was something about the old man's words, and his unshakable calm, that stirred something deep within him. Desperation had brought him here, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. "I will do as you say," the king declared after a pause, surprising his attendants. "Return to the palace without me. I will remain here." The guards and ministers protested, their voices a chorus of concern. But the king silenced them with a wave of his hand. "I did not come this far to cling to my comforts. Leave me be." Reluctantly, the entourage departed, leaving the king alone with the villager. For the first time in his life, the king stood without the trappings of power or the protection of an armed escort. He felt strangely vulnerable, yet also curious about what lay ahead. The old man gestured toward a wooden bench outside his hut. "Come, Your Majesty. Sit with me for a moment." The king obeyed, lowering himself onto the bench. The two men sat side by side, gazing out at the tranquil landscape. The villager said nothing, and the silence stretched on. At first, the king felt restless, accustomed as he was to constant activity and noise. But as the minutes passed, he began to notice the subtle symphony of the world around him, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the soothing murmur of the stream. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply be. After a while, the villager stood and said, "Let us prepare for the evening. Here, we work for what we need." He handed the king a simple tool, a wooden bucket, and led him to the stream. Together, they fetched water, the king marveling at how the old man moved with ease and purpose despite his age. They gathered firewood from a nearby grove, the king's royal hands blistering from the unfamiliar labor. When the work was done, the villager prepared a humble meal of boiled vegetables and bread. The king, used to feasts laden with exotic delicacies, found the fare surprisingly satisfying. As they ate, the old man spoke of his life, of working the land, of living in harmony with the seasons, of finding joy in small, simple things. The king listened, captivated by the villager's perspective. It was a stark contrast to the endless striving and accumulation that defined his own existence. That night, the king slept on a straw mat inside the hut. It was far from the opulence of his palace, yet he felt an unfamiliar comfort in its simplicity. As he drifted off to sleep, he realized he had not thought of his worries all evening. In the days that followed, the king adopted the villager's routine. He woke at dawn, worked the land, and gathered food from the forest. He drank from the stream, tended to the old man's small garden, and sat under the open sky in the evenings, marveling at the stars. At first, the physical labor was grueling, and the king's body ached in ways he had never known. But as time passed, he began to feel a strange lightness. His mind, once burdened with endless thoughts, began to quiet. The old man said little during their time together, letting the king experience the lessons for himself. Yet, his presence was a constant reminder of the peace that was possible. The king, once skeptical, found himself wondering if the answers he sought had been within him all along, obscured by the noise of his palace and the demands of his throne. By the end of his stay, the king felt a transformation taking place. He was no longer the restless, anxious ruler who had arrived at the hut. He had glimpsed a way of life that was foreign yet profoundly fulfilling. Though he did not yet fully understand it, he knew he was closer to the peace he sought. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the king turned to the old man and said, "I think I am beginning to see what you meant. But there is still so much I do not understand. Will you teach me more?" The old man smiled and replied, "You have already begun to learn, Your Majesty. The journey to peace is not one of sudden revelation, but of steady, mindful practice. Stay open, and the answers will come." The king nodded, filled with gratitude and a newfound humility. For the first time, he felt he was on the right path. Chapter 3: Lessons in Simplicity. For the days that followed, the king immersed himself in the old man's humble way of life. Each morning began with the chirping of birds and the first rays of sunlight streaming through the small hut's window. The old man would gently rouse the king at dawn, his voice calm and inviting. Despite his initial reluctance, the king found himself growing accustomed to these early hours, his body waking naturally to the rhythm of the world around him. The morning ritual was simple yet purposeful. With a wooden bucket in hand, they walked together to the stream to fetch water. At first, the king struggled with the weight of the bucket, his royal hands unused to such labor. The old man, patient and understanding, showed him how to balance the load and carry it with ease. Along the way, they would pause to admire the delicate flowers blooming along the path or to listen to the gentle rustle of the breeze through the trees. Next, they tended to the small patch of land the old man called his garden. The soil was rich and dark, yielding vegetables that were both their sustenance and their connection to the earth. The old man guided the king in tilling the soil, planting seeds, and weeding the garden. Though the work was physically demanding, it brought a sense of accomplishment that the king had never felt before. His fingers, once adorned with rings of gold and jewels, now bore the marks of honest labor, and he felt strangely proud of them. The afternoons were spent gathering food from the forest, a task that taught the king not just survival skills, but also a deep respect for nature. The old man explained which plants and berries were safe to eat, how to identify trees that bore edible fruit, and the importance of taking only what was needed so that the forest could continue to thrive. As they worked, the king began to notice the intricate web of life around him, the industrious ants carrying food to their colony, the squirrels darting through the trees, the soft hum of bees flitting from flower to flower. He felt a growing sense of connection to the world, a sense that he was part of something much larger than himself. Meals were a stark contrast to the opulent banquets the king was used to. The old man prepared simple dishes with the food they gathered, boiled vegetables, fresh fruits, and occasionally, a piece of flatbread baked over an open flame. At first, the king found the meals bland and unsatisfying. He craved the spices and rich flavors of his palace kitchen. But over time, his palate adapted, and he began to appreciate the natural flavors of the food. He found himself savoring each bite, aware of the effort it took to bring the meal to the table. Evenings were perhaps the most transformative part of the king's day. After the work was done, they would sit by the fire, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the walls of the hut. The old man would often remain silent, letting the king soak in the tranquility of the moment. For the first time in years, the king found himself listening, not to advisers or courtiers, but to the sounds of the world around him. The gentle chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind became a soothing symphony that calmed his restless mind. One particular evening, as the sky turned from deep blue to a blanket of stars, the king turned to the old man, his expression a mix of curiosity and awe. "I feel different," the king said softly. "Lighter. Happier. It's as though a burden I didn't even know I was carrying has been lifted." "How did this happen?" The old man smiled, his eyes reflecting the glow of the fire. "Your Majesty," he began, "peace does not come from what we acquire or achieve. It comes from letting go of the unnecessary and embracing the simple. Your palace, your treasures, your throne, they are distractions. They bind you with expectations and desires that can never truly be satisfied." The king listened intently as the old man continued. "True peace lies in simplicity, in gratitude, and in living in the moment. When you fetch water from the stream, you are connected to the earth. When you till the soil, you are reminded of the cycles of life. When you gather food, you understand the balance of nature. And when you eat a simple meal, you appreciate the effort and the gift of sustenance. In these acts, you are fully present, and it is in this presence that peace resides." The king reflected on these words, his mind replaying the past few days. He realized that the old man was right. In his palace, he had been surrounded by luxury, yet he had always been consumed by thoughts of the future, of securing more wealth, more power, more glory. Here, in this humble village, he had learned to simply exist in the present, and it had brought him a contentment he had never known. "But how can I bring this peace back to my palace?" the king asked. "Surely, I cannot abandon my duties and live as you do." The old man nodded thoughtfully. "Peace does not require you to abandon your responsibilities, Your Majesty. It requires you to change your perspective. You must learn to carry the simplicity and gratitude you have discovered here into your daily life, no matter where you are. The key is to remain mindful, to focus on what truly matters, and to let go of the rest." The king sat in silence, the old man's words sinking deep into his heart. He realized that his journey was far from over, but he now had a map, a way forward that promised not just peace for himself, but for his kingdom as well. That night, as he lay on his straw mat under the stars, he felt a sense of hope and purpose he had not felt in years. Chapter 4: The Return to the Palace. With a heartfelt farewell to the wise old villager, the king began his journey back to the palace. As he rode through the familiar landscapes of his kingdom, the world seemed different, though it had not changed. The lush green fields, the glistening rivers, and the vibrant marketplaces all seemed more vivid and alive, as though he were seeing them for the first time. The simple life he had lived with the old man had opened his eyes to the beauty he had taken for granted. When the king arrived at the gates of his grand palace, the sight of its opulence no longer filled him with pride, but with a quiet understanding. The towering golden spires and elaborate carvings seemed unnecessary, almost alien to the simplicity he had just experienced. He dismounted from his horse and walked through the grand halls, where ministers and servants rushed to greet him. The air was thick with questions about his journey, but the king raised a hand to silence them. "Let us gather in the great hall," he said calmly. "I have something to share." The king's declaration of change. That evening, the court was filled with an eager yet confused audience. Ministers, nobles, and even commoners were invited to hear the king speak. As he stood before them, the king's attire caught their attention. He had not changed out of the simple clothes he wore in the village. Gone were the jewels and silks, in their place was a plain tunic and sturdy sandals. "My people," the king began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "for years, I have lived in this palace surrounded by wealth and power, yet I was a restless soul. I sought peace in luxury, in victory, and in the counsel of the wisest minds. But none of it brought me the contentment I craved." He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word. "Recently, I left this palace to seek the wisdom of a humble villager, and in his simple way of life, I found the peace I had been chasing. I learned that true contentment does not come from what we own or how much we achieve. It comes from simplicity, gratitude, and living in the present moment. A simplified court and a grateful kingdom." From that day onward, the king began making changes to his life and his court. He started by reducing the excesses of his palace. The lavish banquets that once wasted vast amounts of food were replaced with simpler meals, and the gold-plated ornaments that adorned every room were removed, their proceeds used to help the poor. The king encouraged his ministers and nobles to follow his example, reminding them that leadership was not about indulgence, but about serving others. The king also spent more time among his people. He walked through the markets, spoke to farmers in the fields, and listened to the concerns of merchants and laborers. He realized that understanding his subjects' lives and challenges brought him a deeper satisfaction than the grandest celebrations in the palace ever could. His kindness and humility inspired his people, and they began to emulate his newfound appreciation for simplicity. The court also transformed. The king introduced policies that promoted fairness, generosity, and community. Taxes were reduced for struggling farmers, education was made accessible to more children, and public spaces were built for gatherings, fostering a sense of unity among the people. These changes marked the beginning of an era of prosperity, not just in material wealth, but in the happiness and harmony of the kingdom. Personal practices for inner peace. Though the king embraced his royal duties, he remained committed to the lessons he had learned in the village. Each morning, he woke before sunrise and spent a few moments in quiet reflection, listening to the sounds of nature outside his window. He kept a small garden in the palace grounds, where he tilled the soil with his own hands. The act of nurturing plants became a daily reminder of the simplicity and interconnectedness of life. Even during the busiest days, the king set aside time to pause and express gratitude for the little things, a cool breeze, a kind word from a servant, or the laughter of children playing in the palace courtyard. These practices anchored him, keeping him connected to the peace he had discovered. A legacy of harmony. The king's transformation did not go unnoticed. Word spread throughout the kingdom of the sovereign who had found peace in simplicity. His reign became known as the era of harmony, a golden age where people thrived under his wise and compassionate rule. Artists and poets immortalized his story in their works, and his teachings were passed down through generations. The king often revisited the village to see the old man, not as a monarch but as a student returning to his teacher. They would sit together by the stream, sharing quiet moments and reflecting on the beauty of life. The old man, now frail with age, would smile at the king's progress, knowing that his lessons had taken root not just in the heart of a ruler but in the lives of an entire kingdom. The moral of the story. The King's journey teaches us that true peace and happiness cannot be found in material possessions or worldly success. They lie in simplicity, gratitude, and living in harmony with ourselves and the world around us. By letting go of unnecessary distractions and focusing on what truly matters, we can transform not only our own lives, but also the lives of those around us. This timeless lesson reminds us that the greatest treasures are not those we can see or touch, but those we feel in our hearts.